Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, "Since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family." And Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you." Abram replied to Sarai, "Here, your slave is in your power. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She replied, "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her authority." The angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count." The angel of the Lord said to her, "You have conceived, and you will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. This man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near all his relatives." So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi," for she said, "In this place have I actually seen the one who sees me." That is why the well is called Bir Lahai Roi. It is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him.
A few years ago, I did a talk at the Black History is Church History Conference on a woman named Phyllis Wheatley. If you don't know her story, she was a young American slave living in the 18th century who also became a well-known poet. As I was studying her story, it struck me that she was only 7 years old when she was kidnapped from her homeland and taken away from her family to be sold into slavery. At the time, my son was only 7, and now I have a 7-year-old daughter named Scarlett. And I can't imagine what they would think and how I would feel if that happened to them. Imagine a 7-year-old stripped away from everything they had ever known, thrust into a life of hard labor and abuse, and wondering if they'd ever see their family again, and as they get older, realizing they probably never would. Unfortunately, that story was very common and happened quite often in the sad history of our country. Many black women were not only brought over as young girls, but as they grew up, they were often raped by their owners, essentially serving as concubines for immoral masters whose hand they were under, often forced to bear children, knowing they would probably be separated from them almost immediately and never get a chance to raise that child. Both during that time of slavery, if you read some of the slave writings, and then even after, many black women have found comfort in the story you just heard read of a foreign slave woman named Hagar, as many have found themselves living as unwanted outcasts in their country of dwelling. And the truth that kept them sane in the midst of their suffering, the belief that they held onto in the midst of their pain, was the same one that Hagar learned in Genesis 16, that there is a God who sees the forsaken and the downtrodden. And that no matter our story of origin, no matter how many times we have tried to run, God joins us in our suffering and gives us hope beyond what our eyes could ever see. So good morning again, New Eden family. I think for the third time today. Thank you all for being here. I've had a couple questions about my sweatshirt. It's a Julian Harris Elementary sweatshirt. I'm repping my kids' swag this morning, so I figured that's what this bright red is. I figured I'd get warm enough that it'd come off by this point, but it hasn't. So, and I do have a shirt on underneath. That was really weird. God, this is where my brain goes. All right. We're in Genesis 16, as you can see today. You just heard the story read. I don't have any main points. Sometimes I feel like that's helpful, and sometimes like today, I really just want us to sit in the narrative of what you just heard read. And then we're hopefully going to see how it might transform us by the truths that are contained therein. So to kind of settle us into the story, if you remember last week, we were in Genesis 15, and we saw that God reaffirmed his promises to Abraham through the form of a covenant ceremony. And one of the main things of fulfillment that all this hinges on is an heir. But for now, no heir exists. That is the problem that our story begins with and sets us up that we're actually going to follow for the next few chapters in Genesis. So let's read verse 1 again. Genesis 16:1, the beginning of it says, Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him. Okay, so that just tells us the problem right up front. Now, for the rest of our time, you're going to hear me use Abraham and Sarah because that's what they'll be called very soon, and it's just more comfortable for me. So same people, Abram's name will soon be changed to Abraham, and Sarai's will soon be named to Sarah. So Sarah is getting older. At this point in the story, Abram would have been around 86, as the end of the chapter tells us, which would have made Sarah about 76. Now, we don't know exactly when the age of childbearing generally ceased during this time frame, but based on even future narrative events in our story, it's closing soon if it hasn't already happened. So the problem is presented. We're told that Sarah cannot bear children, has not borne children yet, and so she comes up with her own solution. Sarah tells Abraham that her plan is to take one of the Egyptian slaves that they acquired. If you remember back in Genesis 12, they fled to Egypt during a famine. Most likely this was one of the slaves or one of the descendants of one of the people they left with there. And they're going to use this slave to build up her own family. Abraham's going to have relations with her, and she'll basically serve as a surrogate womb to get what they both desire, an heir. Now, to our ears, this sounds like a really bad idea. Culturally, this was normative, okay? So we need to understand that. It doesn't mean it's okay, but we do have to understand that every ancient Near Eastern society practiced this all the time as a way to provide an heir. As is the case often in Genesis 2, the text doesn't give us a clear moral judgment on this decision, but it does leave some clues for us that we should pay attention to. If you've been following the story of Genesis, the language employed by the author is going to clearly echo language from Genesis chapter 3. And by doing so, it paints this decision in a negative light, even though it might not be for the same reasons that our cultural lens would do so. So Eve took of the fruit and gave to her husband Adam, and he passively listens and partakes. That's the fall narrative in Genesis 3. In the same way, same exact language, Sarah takes her Egyptian slave Hagar and gives her to her husband Abraham, and he passively listens and obeys. Sarah's learned from the best. If you remember, she's been used as a pawn in Abraham's games when he went down to Egypt and he just kind of threw her to the wolves. And here she now uses Hagar as a pawn as she attempts to take control for herself instead of trusting God. So in the story, Abraham takes Hagar as a second wife, has relations with her, and Hagar becomes pregnant. So on paper, Sarah's plan worked. Sarah got what she wanted. All turns out, right? Except, just like often happens in our lives, when we finally get what we desire, we don't really like where it's led us. And we don't like the outcome. Hagar, having lived as a slave woman in Sarah's house and Abraham's house to this point, now has an opportunity to seize a level of power. And of course, she takes advantage. Wouldn't you? In the text, we're told that Sarah communicates it as Hagar is looking on her with contempt. And this seems to imply that Hagar, on some level, understood that the power dynamics had shifted. Whether we like it or not, the reality is, in this society, being able to bear children was a form of power, a form of power currency, so to speak. And now Hagar has more than Sarah in this situation. So Sarah gets upset, again, echoing the garden. She turns around and blames her spouse, even though she invited him to do this, right? Continuing his passivity, Abraham reaffirms to Sarah, hey, you know what? You're in control. In verse 6, the language he uses is that Hagar is in Sarah's power. The word translated power there literally means she is in Sarah's hand, meaning you can do whatever you want with Hagar. Culturally, Abraham could have actually allowed Hagar to take Sarah's place as the matriarch, the new matriarch, but he doesn't, and Sarah takes full advantage. There is no downplaying what's happening here. In verse 6, we're told that Sarah mistreats Hagar. I actually think that translation does downplay it slightly. The word is literally the same word of affliction or oppression that we read in Genesis 15 when God told Abraham that the Israelites were going to be afflicted or oppressed by a people for years before they're delivered. The people God's talking about in Genesis 15 are the Egyptians. And ironically, we have this story right after that prediction, this like micro inversion as Sarah afflicts and oppresses an Egyptian slave. So much so that we're told in verse 6, she runs away. We're not told Hagar's motives for running. Could have been as simple as she's just trying to flee the abuse. It could have been as strategic as her reclaiming agency and power and saying, okay, you want this heir? I'm taking it. And I'm going to run away from you guys so you can't have what you wanted since you misused me. Whatever her motives, we know she flees the situation, staying true to her name, which means, the name Hagar means flight or forsaken. And there's kind of a clear break in the story here. Hebrew commentators understand that it's pretty clear in the Hebrew. There's a break here, and we're kind of left wondering what happens next. You think about this. Sarah and Abraham could not have been on good terms at this point. Their marriage had to be on the rocks. Hagar has fled with their heir, the future, their plan they had, and the cycle continues. Humanity wrestles back control from God, and it ends in a disaster. Simply put, this story is a convoluted, complicated mess. As I was studying this story, like everything in me wanted to fit this story into a neat and moral lesson where there are clear good guys and clear bad guys. Here we have good examples to follow and bad examples to avoid. The problem is we don't really get that. And ironically, if anyone is really screwing up over and over, it's the supposedly heroic patriarch, Abraham. Sarah doesn't get a pass either for the way she treats Hagar, but honestly, she's reacting in ways that are pretty common for anyone in history who's been mistreated. Any level of power I can get, I normally turn around the mistreatment and suffering I've received and turn that on to others. She's been misused as a pawn in Abraham's games, most likely struggled herself as a woman in this patriarchal society. So she lashes out at the only one she can, Hagar, the one who has a lower status than her as a young female Egyptian slave. As many of you know and have experienced, both on the giving end and the receiving end, hurt people hurt people. And poor Hagar gets caught up in the mix of it all. There's no denying clearly that she is the oppressed one in the story, the one who has been the recipient of the abuse, but she's also not without fault. The text does seem to hint that she has exhibited a sense of pride towards Sarah, as if somehow she's inherently better just because she's gotten pregnant and Sarah hasn't. We find our value based on what we can do and perform often. But I get it for her, right? As a foreign woman, most likely much younger than Sarah, no power in this culture. So when she finally found some, she does what any logical human would do from a human perspective. She seizes it, seeking to just flip the script. And so if we were only reading this this story for moral lessons to follow, we'd probably just need to skim past this one. Let's just move to the next one. You can get to circumcision in Genesis 17, and you can find some good moral lessons there. But if we read the story as it's meant to be written, as a theological, historical narrative with God as the primary character, then maybe this can all start to make sense. If we're honest, this story describes how life often really is. Abuses of power, people using power to exercise dominion in an unhealthy way instead of serving, people posturing and seeking to gain control, And many people just caught in the mess, responding however they can. And the question we wonder is this: can and will God show up in the midst of another mess when humanity has screwed up again? Look at verses 7 through 8. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She replied, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai. In the middle of nowhere, God shows up to the nobody in the story. The description here of the one who shows up is called the angel of the Lord. The word angel simply means messenger. That's the literal translation. And though there are different opinions about the nature of this being, I'll let you go explore all of those. The clear idea here is that a direct message from the Lord is coming to Hagar. And there is no doubt that this is exactly how she receives it. She understands that she is communing with God himself. And I love this. This is the creator of the universe, the one who flung the stars into space, who set this whole thing in motion. And for the first time in the story, Hagar is spoken to and identified by name. Abram and Sarai simply called her my slave, a pawn in the game, another object, but not to God. He dignifies her by talking to her directly and calling her by name. God says her name. And he does what he often does, which is start with questions. I love that. Where are you going? Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Hagar bats 1 for 2 on her answers. She tells God she's fleeing Sarah. She doesn't say where she's going because she probably doesn't know. She's just stuck by a body of water, seeking to get some temporary relief to figure out what's next. Doesn't really have a plan. I just want out of that. So she flees. Genesis 16:9, God tells her to quit fleeing and to go back home. The CSB translate it in verse 9 as submitting to Sarah's authority. Now, there's some play on words here. The word authority is literally translated hand, the same word translated power earlier. The word translated submit there is actually the same exact word we've seen translated as mistreatment, and we'll see translated as affliction a little bit later. So the idea here is that when someone is doing this to others, it is an active oppression or affliction. But when one is doing it to oneself, as God calls Hagar to do, it is the idea of humbling yourself or being willing to bring yourself low. You'll even see the psalmist sometimes pray to be afflicted in the sense of being humbled. He's calling Hagar to radical obedience and trust, to humble herself and return, not in arrogance over Sarah, trying to posture and get a little bit of power that she could get as if that would finally fulfill her, but rather to return in humility, understanding that her journey is of grace alone as well. Now, I want to say, as a side note, it would be incredibly dangerous to read this and assume that it is a unilateral command that applies to all situations of abuse. It is not. I want to say that clearly. There will be a lot of times that we see God speak into key moments of the story, and he gives these commands that are a part of a much larger narrative and a bigger point, but our Western ears hear it, and we get stuck on that one little thing. An example, asking Abraham to kill his own son. Kevin gets that text. He'll come tell you what that means. I think those commands should not be seen as normative, and definitely should not be seen as condoning either murder or, in this case, abusive treatment. Okay, so I want to be clear about that. But we can't sugarcoat the weight of this either. In this situation, God does clearly call Hagar to return back to a volatile and potentially life-taking situation. Not too long ago, a good friend of mine was telling me about a time in life where he was working for a boss that seemed to be continually participating in what could be categorized as emotional abuse. And the way he described it, I kept asking God to be released from that situation. And for a long time, God's answer was, not yet. Eventually, God did release him to leave the job, and God was faithful to care for him in the midst of the frustrating situation until it was time to go. But I can't tell you what you're called to do. But in the same way here, God calls Hagar to return, not to flee, at least not yet. In chapter 21, Hagar will leave this situation, but God still has work to do. And so remember, even though our modern Western ears get stuck here often, that's not the main point. We can process that further later, but the main point is actually what follows next. And you'll notice Hagar doesn't get stuck on that command either. God assures Hagar that even though the child in her womb is the result of his own people misusing her and taking power into their own hands, that she and her child would both be cared for. The promise he gives to Hagar is very similar to the one he gives to Abraham, except for the land. The descendants of her son will be great. Her household will be greatly built up. Sarah tried to use Hagar to build up her own house, but God will see to it that it is used for Hagar's good. In verse 11, the messenger of the Lord says that she has conceived and she will have a son, and that his name will be Ishmael, which means God hears. And if we have any questions of whether God really has Hagar's good in mind, the passage states it explicitly in verse 11, that the Lord, Yahweh, has heard her cry of affliction, and he's shown up to take care of her. This language foreshadows the large-scale inversion of this story when the people of Israel would cry out their cries of affliction, and God would hear them and deliver them. We're told that the son Ishmael will be the literal translation is a wild donkey man. That's actually not the most literal translation. I'll let you figure out the literal translation for donkey on that one. It's the same word I snickered growing up when I heard the King James read. You can figure that out, but the wild donkey man. Some of you might call your kids that, and it might be accurate, especially the second born kids, right? So the messenger here is simply stating what will happen. It's proven to be true, even in this age, even to the age we live in now. So God's spoken for most of this conversations. Hagar's answered one question, and then God has flooded her in verses 9 through 12. And so the question is, what will her response be after hearing all of this? Will she get caught up in the call to radical obedience? No, that doesn't make sense. Or will she maybe want more clarity about her son's future? Can you explain what that really means? Will she try to learn all the details of how Sarah and Abraham might respond when she returns home? Look with me at verses 13 and 14 to see her response recorded. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roy." For she said, "In this place, have I actually seen the one who sees me?" That is why the well is called Bir Lahai Roy. And what that word means is I have seen the living one. Like anyone who has truly experienced God, she found herself caring only about the fact that she had seen the one who saw her. She names God El Roy, the first person recorded in the scriptures to give God a name. El Roy means the God who sees. And she asks in wonder, have I actually seen the one who sees me? Me? This Egyptian slave girl, most likely still very young, who's been caught up in the schemes of Abraham, going back years before when he fled to Egypt, now experiencing suffering at the hands of Sarah, this nobody, an other, a woman in a patriarchal society, a sojourner in a foreign land, a slave in the house, easily discarded and forsaken, and no one would ever care. We can get another one. Line them up. But God sees her. He sees her and he hears her and he meets her in the wilderness by a spring of water to give her assurance and hope. To both the nation of Israel's ears who would have heard this read the first time, And to our ears, Hagar doesn't fit in our neat boxes of those who we think deserve God's grace. Even when I read this, I think, no, God, those are the people we're supposed to be against. Her descendants are the ones we're not supposed to like. People like her, slaves, Egyptians, the others, they don't belong. But maybe that's the point of the story. That God is a God who sees the most unlikely of people in the most unlikely of places. And this is good news for those who feel as if they don't belong in God's kingdom for whatever reason that may be. This story would have been impactful for the nation of Israel. As they heard it recounted, as they're wandering through the wilderness, it would have reminded them to trust God, to let him be in control. And this is no different for us, church. When we attempt to operate apart from him, it ends poorly, even when we're attempting to do his work. Sarah and Abraham were supposed to figure out a way to produce an offspring, right? It was God's promise. They just did it in their own way. And as we often do, they saw themselves primarily as having to work for God instead of being invited to work with God. And there's a massive difference. One is life-giving and one will drain you to the point of exhaustion. And chaos ensues. I often find myself making decisions in my own strength. And sure, I'll stamp God's name on them. I know the good words to say, the way to Christianize it up. But often I'm seeking to work out what God has promised me, but in my own timing and in the way that I want it to look. This story would have also reminded Israel to care for the other among them. Over and over and over, God reminds them to care for the foreigner, the immigrant, and the former slaves in their midst, because that's who they once were. And the moment we move past that, I think we've earned somehow God's favor. That's when we start treating others around us like crap. This story would have broken all of their categories for who the good guys were and the bad guys were, and again, made this story stand to remind us of the same. I often hear the way others are talked about, yes, even in the church and among Christians, and sometimes primarily so, and it grieves me. Side comments about someone because of their race, their gender, or their socioeconomic status, assumptions. And maybe some of the worst of it is not even the overtly prejudiced comments, but just the ignoring of those seen as less than or other. Like Sarah and Abraham ignoring Hagar's name, seeing her as no more than an object to be used. They only have value in so much as they advance my ideas. We often categorize others, make judgments based on a stereotype that either we formed or we've been taught, and we never take the time to know someone's name, to hear their story or understand their situation. Where are you coming from? Why do you feel this way? Sometimes we're more concerned with arguing a political position or winning a theological argument that we demean anyone who's not in our tribe. The battle lines have been drawn, and those over there are not worthy of our energy and compassion. And we justify it because we're doing God's work, right? We got to get it. We got to win the battle for God. And I'm guilty, guys. Like Sarah, I lash out at others because I've been hurt. I've been overlooked. I've felt that and it sucks and I don't like it. I've been made to feel as if I don't belong. And so any little bit of pride I can get, I find faults in other individuals or groups. At least I'm not like them. I run with it. So this story reveals dangers. It warns us of cautions that we need to have, not only for the nation of Israel when they first heard it read, but for us as God's people, the church. But here's the thing. I love this. The scriptures never bring the cut of conviction without bringing incredible hope. It doesn't leave us there. Like I said earlier, this story is a mess. Sin has infected all the individuals in this story, and it will infect entire nations soon. And we can relate to this. We have all been hurt by someone else's sin. We've been the recipients of sin toward us. And we've all turned around and hurt others through our sin. There's sin in the world, both on individual levels and systemic levels. I mean, there's people who are even arguing that it's one or the other, and there's whole, debates about it. Like it's both. Like it's there. I try to categorize it. Good luck. It's infected everything. There is brokenness and injustice, even here in our own city. And so often we find ourselves like Hagar in the wilderness, just sitting by any little temporary source of relief we can get, just to get another day, but wondering what the future holds, running from our problems, not knowing where we're headed, wandering aimlessly without hope, the outcast, all alone and forsaken. And we don't even really know whose fault it is. It's a giant mixed bag of emotions. But the last and main truth this story would have taught Israel and us is this: that God sees. God hears Hagar's cries of affliction. Later, he would hear the nation of Israel's cries of affliction, and he still hears and sees today. When you think you're yelling into the vast void, God is bottling up the tears of his saints, and it is not meaningless. No matter where you are, no matter where you come from, no matter where you're headed, and if you don't even know, God sees you. The world may have overlooked you. You may have been the recipient of horrible abuse and sin, and you may have committed horrific sin toward others and toward God. But into the mess, God sees you, and he's not just met you there. He has moved on your behalf. We see this most clearly in the fact that the God of the universe became man and met humanity in our wilderness when we were fleeing. Years after this messenger appeared to Hagar, there was another messenger that appeared to a lonely, downtrodden girl in the middle of nowhere named Mary. She was also told that she was with child, and God gave him a name. But this was the name of Jesus. For God had not only heard, he had come himself to save his people from their sins. The Apostle Paul makes this clear. John makes this clear. Jesus is the true messenger of God. If you want to see God, look to the face of Christ. All who stare at the face of Christ have seen the one who sees them. In Jesus dwells the exact representation of God, the full imprint of his character. God himself has come to conquer and will reign victorious. But he will do this in the most unexpected way ever. God did not call Hagar to anything that he wasn't willing to do himself. God humbled himself by becoming flesh. We're told by becoming a slave, even to the point of death on a cross. With his life, he showed us that all were invited in. This story of God meeting Hagar at this body of water sets up like this type scene that will continue throughout the scriptures, and Jesus fulfills it when he shows up to the woman at the well. This Samaritan woman with a complicated past, and says, I'm gonna give you living water so that you will never thirst again. All of your longings, all of the things you desire, I am them. Told her everything she ever did. Saw every bit of baggage. That story doesn't normally end well when you point out people's faults, unless the one that fully knows you also fully loves you, and you know it. Then you go proclaim it from the freaking rooftops. Look, here's a man who told me everything I ever did. You gotta see him. Your life will be changed. But this message of acceptance toward all was so radical and scandalous that eventually it got him killed. When you stand with the outcast, be prepared to receive the wrath of all those who are workers of injustice and oppression, because you threaten the status quo. You threaten the religious leaders who have their system set up. Jesus goes to the cross and receives in his body the worst injustice ever. He bears it all. He knows what it's like to be the recipient of vicious abuses of power. He could have called 10,000 angels. He could have invited them to come rescue him, but willingly he bears it all to conquer sin on our behalf. And he's laid in the tomb, The enemy thinks they have him. The devils dance on his grave, thinking the troublemaker had been thrown out one last time. But they didn't think their plans through any better than Sarah. Because what they meant for evil, God turned to good. And on that third day, Jesus stamps out death and rises from the grave, proving that even in the darkest hour of humanity, when all the earth is going dark, God still has seen and acted. Jesus meets us in our ultimate mess. He humbly surrenders to the Father's will. And by rising again, he has conquered death, hell, and the grave. He is the victor, church. There is hope. There's a reason we come in, and in the midst of troubles, we can still sing. He lives. He lives. He has won the war. Once and for all, it is finished. And through this good news, through the gospel, through the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, we learn that God's solutions to our problems are much better, much bigger, and much more holistic than our own. Because through this, you know what God is doing? He's creating a whole new family where strife is cast out. And because he has accomplished the work, there is no earning in this family. In fact, the grounds to enter are to simply admit that you ain't got nothing to bring to the table. And if you think you do, we need to have another conversation about what we believe about the gospel. There is no value or merit in this kingdom on the basis of ethnicity, power dynamics, male or female, or any other societal marker we love to create. A lot of us have the big prejudices down, but we love the little ones, right? What kind of schooling you do, what kind of baseball you play, travel ball, rec ball, pick it. We love to posture and compare and get that little bit of advantage we can. There is none of that in the kingdom of God. As the old saying goes, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. Like Hagar, your story may be marked by running. Your identity may have once been forsaken. But God pursues us to the far reaches of the world. There is no wall he won't kick down, no lie he won't tear down coming after you. And he invites us into a home and a family. And I'm pretty convinced that both Hagar and Sarah are spending eternity as reunited sisters in Christ, both no longer worried about what happened back here in Genesis 16, but instead basking in the awe and glory of God because both of them needed the same Savior. Only God could write a story like this. If you wonder if God sees, if you doubt if God cares, if you question if he's acted, look to the cross of Christ, where he became man on your behalf. And this church is how we are transformed. You are not changed by learning more, by just figuring it out and putting it in a little, category that you can figure out and following some examples like we should study, we should know, we can't worship what we don't know. But here's the thing, church, what changes us, Paul says we are transformed from one degree of glory to another by beholding the beauty of Christ. When we have seen the one who truly sees us, when we know the one who fully knows us, we cannot leave unchanged. It is impossible. Like Hagar, the details might not be all tidy and neat. I know a lot of your lives. It's a mess. There's still questions and a long journey ahead. But all we know is that we've seen Jesus, and that's enough. And when this happens, church, the things that we're called to do, the warnings that this passage gives us, you can't just manufacture those. But when we see Christ, when we realize how free we are in him, we are free to then see others. When we actually believe that we're fully seen by God and not seen, like I think I'm seen by God, I have no problem believing that, but I think his posture towards me is one of anger. And so that's the way I treat others. That's the way I respond. But when I begin to believe that God sees me not with anger, but with joy, I can begin to see others that way. Even ones that don't fit the world's categories, that don't advance my own purposes. We don't have to posture and try to earn applause so we can be seen and feel better about ourselves. We're free to take a back seat and be spent for the sake of others. We're free to listen, not have to always get the last word in. We're free to not have to correct every misspoken idea. That one's for me. We're free to listen to the pain of others when they feel unseen or like the outcast. When we become to know that we are secure in the Father's love, when the Spirit graciously opens our eyes to see our relationship from his perspective, that actually frees us. The Father's heart is toward your good. When you begin to believe and understand that you are not just a hired hand in the household of God, they don't exist, but rather you are a son and a daughter with all the privileges and rights contained therein, that changes us. Like a father who returns home after a long day's work and their kids run up to him. And I envision right now, Maddie Wren's the only one who does it. But she runs out and I get down on her level to see her. I look her in the eyes and I just pick her up and give her a big old hug, squeezing her guts out because I want her to know, I don't want her to have any doubts how much I love her. Do we see God that way toward us? And if not, what's holding you back from receiving that truth? What are we hanging on to that refuses to believe what the scriptures plainly tell us, that you have an Abba who sings songs of joy over you? What is it that gives us the motivation that we've got to hold on to just survive in this life, get that next little well, that next little thing to just get us the next day, instead of just receiving what we've already been given, a free well of the water of life? When I see my kids, flaws and all, I look at them and tell them, you're so freaking amazing. Oh, I'm so glad God made you mine. Do we not think that God looks on us with infinitely more joy than I ever could as a flawed father? And so let the story of Hagar, this young, foreign, outcast slave girl, remind you that no matter who you are, whether you relate more to Abraham or Sarah or Hagar in this story, God sees you. And he has gotten down on your level and offered you the greatest love that you could ever know. He is the God who sees. And in Christ, he has made himself fully known.